Good morning. Second talk of the day. We're almost at lunch, so we'll get through this fast. So my name is Divya Sasidharan. I am a developer advocate at Netlify, and if you haven't used Netlify, you should. It is a it's basically a company that tries to encourage developers to adopt a new architecture, which is where you split your front end and your back end. So you use your front end, like what Diana was talking about earlier. You create your front end code, and then you use your back end as services. So you create APIs and so on. And so Netlify tries to foster that kind of a workflow by creating command line interfaces, and we have an app where you can deploy your stuff and use serverless functions and all those cool stuff. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Netlify in this talk. But you can feel free to ask me questions or come up and chat with me later. And you can find me online at ShortDiv. It's pretty obvious why that is my handle, but cool. So just a plug, if you are looking for a job, Netlify got a bunch of money recently, which means that we're hiring. And so again, if you're interested in joining the team, let me know, and I can introduce you to people, and we can get the ball rolling on that. All right, so to begin, we're gonna go through a couple of examples of applications that you're probably familiar with. So this is, does anyone know what this is? It's Instagram. So this is Instagram right after you finish editing and tweaking your photos, and when you're trying to add captions and tag people and so on. And so this is what you see when you are at that stage in the app. And this is Google Maps, where you have to fill in all of the various input fields, where you're going, where you're currently, and then Google will give you mapping directions and so on. And then this one is similar to Google Maps in the sense where it goes from destination to current location. And what all of these have in common is that they use forms as a basis for interaction. Whether when you think about it, it's basically a form. It's basically input fields that are prettified. Don't think that's a word, but it makes it look nicer. But ultimately, you're creating and filling in those input fields and then interacting with the app. And so there is this rap analogy, which is cash rules everything around me, but I'd like to change it to be forms rule everything around me, because most of our applications that we interact with are actually just forms in disguise to some form. And the thing about forms is that when we think about them, we hate them. As developers, we hate working with forms. As users, we hate filling out forms, because most of the user experience of forms just suck. They're terrible. And so at the same time, there are good forms out in the world. So TurboTax is a really great example. I think overused to some extent, but they are a very good example of how to build a form right. Because taxes are terrible, and no one likes, I've never actually heard anyone who isn't a tax professional who enjoys doing taxes. And so TurboTax makes it a little easy. They handhold you, they give you a lot of feedback as you're filling out the form. So you feel a lot better when you do your taxes, and they have a lot of language and help text and so on. And so that's one example of a good form that at least I can come up with. And so with that, we're gonna just think about what makes a good form, what are the characteristics of a good form, and then we'll talk about the applications to how we can build those in Vue.js. And so there are many ways that you can characterize and call what is a good form, and these are some of them, but we're gonna focus on a couple of them. Being a good form is doing stuff, and I'll explain what that means later. A good form is talkative, a good form is unbreakable, and a good form is fun. So we'll start with the first one, which is a good form is doing stuff. And so what that means is that, let's say, this is an example. So I really like tea, and so I tend to use this as an example in a lot of my talks. So I recently found this wonderful beverage called fogs, which are lattes, like tea lattes. And I think tea always gets a bad rep, especially in the US, because they're pretty boring. But tea lattes are wonderful because it's basically like the sophistication of coffee, but for tea. And so there's different kinds of fogs that you can get. So think of it like different beans, I guess, in coffee. I don't drink coffee, so I don't know. But here we have like the idea of a tea fog. and then you can pick the type of tea that you want. And so in tea, similar to how you pick beans, you can pick the type of tea you want. And so Earl Grey is just the regular, it's called a London fog. It's fairly standard. And I think it's the first of all the fogs that were created. And then there's the matcha fog, which is called a Tokyo fog. And then I guess from there you can guess what the rest are called. But I like what I'm trying to get at is the idea of when you select a specific radio button, it updates the image that you see. And so in a sense, when I say a form is doing stuff, it makes you feel like you're being successful. So when you're actually clicking through and adding and updating input elements, the form updates accordingly, so you feel like you're actually making progress through the form. And so just to give you a big refresher of what the input element is, because that's pretty much what the form that I'm talking about here is. An input element is just, I'm using a radio button, and then I'm giving it a name, which is the type of the tea, because it is the type of the tea. And then there's a value associated with it. There is this idea of whether or not the radio button is checked or not. And then you have this @change event. So whenever you click on an unchecked radio button, it checks itself. And so in Vue, this is a lot of code, but we'll walk through it slowly. You have this idea of the label and input, which is what I showed you earlier. You have that radio button. And then what we're doing is we're going to add additional pieces to it. And because there's multiple types of tea, we're going to use the for loop, which is the v-for directive in Vue. And so if we have like a bunch of teas, like Earl Grey, matcha, rooibos, and yerba mate, you can use the v-for to iterate through all of those, and then it gives you separate input elements, which is really nice because then you don't have to repeat yourself to create those input elements. And then with that, you can use this checked. And so checked is, again, checking whether or not a current item is checked or not. And so what that is we have this data attribute called chosen tea. And so the default of the chosen tea is Earl Grey. And so what check does is it checks whether or not that item matches whatever that chosen element is. And then the input basically just updates to make sure that whenever you check something, it updates based on what that target element is. And so what you have is this idea of like checked an input that updates this chosen tea. And in Vue, what that is it's basically the reactivity in a nutshell. And the nice thing is that you can actually truncate a lot of this code. So you have vmodel. And what vmodel does is it's just that @input and the value together. And so you yourself as a developer don't have to manage and wrangle a lot of that event updates yourself, which is really nice and really convenient and super cool. So I'm going to jump in a demo. I'm not going to click the link because CodePen wasn't kind to me today. But ignore this because this is actually like, I built a Vue and React thing. So if you're actually interested in the difference in the reactivity systems, this is a great example. But I'm going to focus on the green because Vue that's the color of Vue. And so every time I click on a specific button, it updates the name of that fog latte. And so the default is Earl Grey, so it's called a London fog. Irish breakfast is called a Dublin fog. And you see where this is going. Like every tea is associated with like the city to some extent. Although, so rooibos is Cape Town. I actually disagree with yerba mate because I would associate it with Argentina, not Montreal, but I don't know, the people who created it just attributed it to Montreal, so I guess that's that. So that's one way of showing that a form is doing things. Every time you click something, something happens. And so you're making progress through the form. And so the other attribute that I like to focus on is that a form is talkative. What I mean by that is that every time you make a selection, your form tells you that you've done something. So it's similar to the previous idea, except that your form is actually talking to you, or I like to think that it's talking to you, and there's a bit of a personal relationship. And so here, there's this notification that pops up when you submit a form that tells you that you submitted the form, because sometimes it is frustrating when you submit a form and you don't know if it's submitted or not. And so with that, what we have is this idea of the input elements that I talked about. I added an additional thing called milk, because tea usually is drunk with milk, at least in my world. And then you have this notification that pops up when you submit it successfully. And so in the code, what we're doing is we're going to create a notification element that basically works alongside that T element that we created. And so what notification is, again, it's like the template and script tag, the single file component that you're familiar with in Vue. Then you have this idea of it takes in a prop of a status. And so status is what happens, what gets passed to the notification on successful fetch. So when a form successfully submits, then on the return of that promise, then status will be created, and then status will be passed to notification. You don't have to know a lot about what exactly that is, but just so you know. And then we have this idea of a v-if. So ultimately, you don't want a notification to show up when it doesn't need to show up. So in this case, the notification only shows up when you have successfully submitted a form. It also shows up if you have failed to submit the form. So it just tells you that you've done something. And so the v-if is a conditional that allows you to make sure that that element only shows up on the page when you want it to. And so we'll tie that to a specific data attribute, which is has notification, which is by default false, because we don't want it to show up when it's not needed. And then we'll use a watcher. And in Vue, a watcher basically checks to see whether or not props have changed. So when status gets passed through, status is a prop. When that prop changes, we can do stuff with it. We can do stuff once we are notified that that happens. And so here, we're just making sure that the notification, the has notification is now true. And so the component knows to render itself. And then I'm going to create this idea of like a countdown, which basically automatically removes the notification, which is really nice because sometimes it's annoying when a notification pops up and it requires the user to actually click the cross button. So here, what we're doing is we're just making it so that it's automatic. So it shows it to you. You can read it in the time that it takes usually to read, and then it removes itself after, I think, 3 seconds. And so here's a quick demo of what that looks like. So we have the same form that I showed you, where you can select whatever you want, and then you can click create order, and it creates that submit button, and you can close it if you'd like. And so again, like it's really nice because it's a tiny little piece of information, but it gives you that knowledge that you have done something successfully with forms. And so the other thing that's really nice about forms is this idea of helper text, because in this case, it's fairly contrived because you know what milk is. But if you were to go back to thinking about taxes, there are lots of terminology that you might not be familiar with because most of us, I assume, are not tax professionals, and so we wouldn't know what like certain things mean. And so input text is useful because when someone is going through a form, they're usually frustrated, annoyed, and so the help text gives them feedback or input into what exactly that input requires. And so here, when you click on milk, it shows you what milk is in regards to tea. Again, contrived example, but it shows you a little bit about how help text can give you some knowledge of that specific input that you're selecting. And so what we have is like this specific input text that shows up and gets removed based on when you click a specific thing, it toggles it. And so that demo looks kind of like this. Yes. Oh, it's very tiny. But yeah, so you have an idea of like a little tiny button, and when you click on it, it shows you, I'm really sorry, it's very small. But yeah, so when you click on it, it shows you help text, and then you can click on it to remove it again. So it's really nice because again, as you're filling out a form, you're informed of exactly what you're required to fill in at that specific piece of the form. And another really nice piece and characteristic of a good form is that it's unbreakable. And unbreakable meaning that when you, does this play? Yes. When you update options, other options get dwindled. So usually when you make selections, you dwindle down other opportunities to select other things. So for example, here, when I click on Earl Grey, I have access to both whole and soy milk. But if I click on Irish breakfast, that soy milk gets disabled because you do not have that option in this specific application. So what that shows you is that there's the ability to toggle whether or not certain options are available based on things you already selected. So in Vue, what we'll do is we'll create this idea of like, we have the same thing, we have that same v4, in this specific instance, it's milk. And so we have this disabled attribute. And what disabled does is it checks whether or not a selection has been made and whether that selection is available. And so it's a bit complex, but I can walk you through like exactly how I did it, which is like I created an array of types of tea that's available. So like Earl Grey, for example, there's like a bunch of different fogs that are available, and then whole milk has a bunch of different fogs available. And I try to match those arrays together to be like, is this available? Is this a thing? And so with Earl Grey, when you select Earl Grey, you have that option in whole milk. And then in Earl Grey, you also have that option in soy milk because there are different teas that are associated. And Irish breakfast, that is the case for whole milk, but it doesn't have it for soy milk, and therefore it's disabled. So it feels very naive, and I know like this isn't the actual point of this whole application, so like don't at me, but what I'm trying to get at is the idea that you have the ability to change options in your form, and that allows the user to not have the cognitive load of having to decide multiple things and know that selecting one option means that they can't select another. So you as a form are trying to give that information to the user without having them know that specifically. Let's see. This one is here. Yeah, so we have, again, the same form that I created. And so Earl Grey has like whole milk and soy milk, and it changes because soy milk is Manchester. I don't know, people patent names strangely. And when you click on Irish breakfast, you no longer have that soy milk option. Another really cool thing is that, for example, if you have like soy milk selected, and then you change your selection to Irish breakfast, it like automatically is like, nope, you can't have soy milk. You have to have it with whole milk. So that's like one little tiny thing that makes a form a little better, because then the user doesn't have to like know what exactly is happening. They just know that you can't select specific things when they make different decisions. The other thing about forms that is, I forget what this characteristic is, but another really cool thing about forms that makes it really usable is this idea of like giving the user knowledge of what exactly they're inputting. So usually whenever there's an input field, and if you use just the general HTML input field attribute, it doesn't format things for you. I think you can use type tell, but it doesn't really do much in terms of like giving you access to how your information looks like to you. Because in the US, when we think of phone numbers, we think of our area code, and then we think of like the 3-digit and the 4-digit. It's usually like specifically oriented. So there's the brackets, and then there's the dashes. And so when you're typing in a phone number, it can be a bit confusing if you don't have that formatting, because you're like, wait, I don't know exactly how this looks like. And so to a user, that's kind of frustrating. And so input, I think in this case, it's called input masking. So you're just taking that raw input, but you're masking it so the user actually doesn't see that raw input. It just sees this like prettified thing. And to do that, what I'm doing is I'm creating this input element. We talked about input elements. It's the same thing. And then we have this idea of value. So here I'm kind of finagling the event bindings a little bit, because I need access to like the key up, key down, specifically for like when you click escape and when you do other things like enter. And so value is just the attribute, which is format number. And then what I'm doing is I have this key up. And key up is what handles that change. So it checks whether or not it's a valid number character, so it doesn't allow alphabets, yes, and symbols. And then it does the same for checking whether or not you clicked on the delete button. So it does like some regexy things, which you don't have to know about. But what happens is that all I want you to focus on is this idea of like being able to grab key bindings and then make changes and call methods based on those key bindings that get pressed. So this is like just a quick way of what that looks like. I know there was a GIF, but yeah, it's kind of nice if there's a demo. So you can type on things, and then it updates in real time. And so as a user, if you forget your phone number, it's easy to like recall and read it rather than just looking at it from a raw input. And the other thing about a good form is that it's really fun to complete. I really like this. This is not a demo I built. I just really like it. because it's just this idea of like when you type in your username and your password, it can be pretty boring, but it's adorable. And so it's really nice because it has these little tiny like delightful moments that you don't actually notice, or you don't notice until you do the thing and then you see what happens. And filling in a form has never felt more fun. I hate it. I always hate like logging into stuff because it's really annoying. And I tend to use like autofill that 1Password has. But this makes me actually want to type something into the box just to see the animation. And so in a sense, that's like a great form because then people want to fill in the things because they want to see what's happening. Yes. I'm not going to go into the demo because the demo is basically this. But you can feel free to play around with it. It's super fun. I think it's called Password Yeti on CodePen. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And so there's another one that I built, which is like a quick interface that checks whether or not you hear Yanni or Laurel. And I don't think it's like a huge debate now. It was like a couple months ago, and I built like, anyway, it was like a quick little demo that I built, which basically allows you to poll audiences to be like, hey, do you hear this or this? And then you can click, and then you can submit it, and then it gives you access to the results of the poll. And polls are super fun because they are really short and doesn't require a lot of like input from people, because you're like, hey, answer this question or like this series of questions, and people do, which is why BuzzFeed polls are really popular because they're usually really inane and quick. And people get access to that data and they're like, oh, cool, how do I stand in regards to like the rest of the population, which is really cool. And so the demo for that is, if you're actually interested, the form is live. It is called like, oh God, it's so bad. Yeah, I'll share the link later, but basically you have the same idea of a form and you can like select whatever you want. I hear Yanni, I don't know how people hear Laurel, just insane. And so when I click on it, is it broken? I think my internet, oh, wait. It worked a bit, yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, it was just a bit slow. But yeah, so you get the idea of like instant feedback. You click on something and then it's like, cool, and then it bounces and you see like where you stand in regards to everyone else, and it seems like this pretty even split between Yanni. Well, Yanni is pretty high up there, but I guess both is too. And so that's like one quick way of just making forms really fun. And of course, like this is a really contrived example. This talk has a lot of contrived examples, but it's just to point out specific things that make a form good that you can then take back to like your giant applications and other forms that you build that are more realistic. And so I just want to talk a little bit about this specific form that I built using like polling the audience. And so what it does is it's pretty complex. And I'll share the code for that later because it uses Vuex and Vue Router. And so you have this idea of a component, which is like the polling component. And then it has a bunch of like actions, mutations, and state. And it connects to Netlify and Firebase, Firebase is the store. And so Diana talked earlier about how you can use Vue for the front end, and then you can use services for the back end. And so I'm using Netlify and Firebase as my back end. Because it's really easy. Then I can prototype quickly. I can check whether or not things work. And if things work, then I can like figure out my own backend if I really want to. And so that's what it comes to. This is actually specific to developers, not users. So I kind of deviated a little bit because a good form is fun to work on. As a developer, whenever someone says you have to build a form, there's like always a collective groan because no one likes to work on forms. It's similar to emails. No one likes to work on emails. And so forms get a bad rap for that. And so how can we make it fun to work on? And so with Netlify, there is an ability for you to push forms and use forms online. So it saves a lot of your backend data. So whenever you submit a form, you can actually access that information on Netlify. So you don't have to like figure out, you don't have to like, at the get-go, find out how exactly you're going to save that data. You can just host it on Netlify, figure out how to use it, and then once you figure out that piece, you can just push it somewhere else if you really want to. And so again, you have this idea of a form. Nothing new about that. It's just like a template with a script tag. And then we want to give it a name, because your form needs a name. Netlify requires your form to be named. And then you need to have a method which is post, because the form posts. And then these two are actually really important because they tell Netlify that there is a form present on the page. And so it's just like you give it data attributes, which is whether data Netlify true, just basically the build bots check whether or not that form is using Netlify. So Netlify true means the form is using Netlify. And then the honeypot is used specifically for preventing against spam, because that's a very common one. Whenever you have forms, there's always spam associated, and dealing with spam is always a pain. And so Netlify honeypot kind of allows you to get around that. They also have other things like reCAPTCHA, but I won't go into that in this talk. And then in the input field, this is the hidden input. So it's related to the honeypot that I mentioned. It basically allows, it circumvents bots from entering information into your form, because humans don't see this, but bots do, because it's hidden from a user, but a bot will see that as an input and like type things into it. And so that's another way of like preventing against spam, which is really cool. And then, of course, like submit.prevent, you can handle the submit yourself, which is really nice because then you can handle exactly what gets submitted and in what format. And so the handle submit, I'm pretty much doing like a fetch that uses the method post to post that data. And then there's some other like encoding stuff that goes into it, but I won't go into that again. But ultimately what I'm doing is I'm posting the body of my form into to Netlify so that it has that access to it. And so with that, on successful submit, I'm going to use like Vue router, so it routes to specific pages on success or on failure. In the previous example, when I talked about submission, there was like the notification box that pops up to be like, hey, you submitted your form, but it doesn't change the page. And so in this case, whenever you submit a form, it like changes the page. It moves to that page. So when I showed you the poll, when you submit the poll, it goes to the page where it shows you the poll, or like the results of the poll. And so that's how I'm using it, using Vue router. So I can route it to a new page quite easily. And then this is just a bunch of code for like how Vue router works. The documentation is wonderful. And so again, this is just implementation details, but the idea is that I'm setting my route. So the path for the main is the form. And then there's like this idea of a thanks page, which is like, thanks for submitting. And then there's a 404 if like things didn't work out. And I highly recommend Chris's pre-render spa plugin, because with Netlify, when you use forms, you have to pre-render, because most of your stuff on Netlify is hosted on a CDN. And in order for the build bots, which basically process your form submissions, in order for them to know that there is a form on the page, you need to pre-render it. Because otherwise, if it's client-side rendered, the bots don't notice it, and your forms don't get submitted properly. And so the pre-render spa plugin makes it really easy, so you can stay within your current workflow of creating, like if you create a Vue app using create Vue app, or using the Vue CLI, you can just like add this to your Vue config quite easily, and then your app is automatically pre-rendered, and then you can push it up, and Netlify knows that it's there. And then the other cool thing about forms with Netlify is that you can actually use serverless functions with them. So when you submit the form, there's this hook that you can use called submission created, and it's in the functions folder. So if you have all your folders, you have a functions folder, you have submission created, and that actually gets run when your form is submitted. So every time your form is submitted and Netlify is notified, it calls that function, which is cool because then you can do like fun server-side stuff. Like in this case, I'm using this specific piece to call to Firebase to like post data and like grab data from. And so you can do like lots of different things with it, add services that you can hook into to third-party apps and so on, which makes your application very extensible. So you can focus on the front end of it and then just like offload a lot of extra services to other third-party plugins. And so when you submit the form, basically on Netlify, it looks like this. You have the main console, so it looks like this. And so when you click on the specific thing, once you deploy this like a forms piece, you click on forms, and then it gives you access to like the active forms on the page. And so here, there's like the Yanni v. Laurel form. And when you click on that, you have access to all of your submissions. And so that's super cool because then you don't have to handle and like figure out how to wrangle that data yourself. Because Netlify is like, hey, look, this is your data, and then you can use it. There's a REST API that you can call, so you can grab that data and like do whatever you want with it, or save it somewhere else if you so choose. And so just to wrap up, a good form does stuff for you on your behalf. It is talkative because it tells you when you've done things well. It also is like a good moral boost for you as you're submitting things. It's unbreakable because you're able to, you know intuitively what's happening as you're filling them out. And it's super fun because like you get joy and delight from filling out a form, which is not, like it usually doesn't go in the same sentence, but that's what makes a good form a good form. And so with that, here's like some CodePen slides. It's in a collection, and yeah, and yeah, cool. Thank you. I'll take questions if anyone is interested in taking me up on that. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the watcher that you have.
Yeah.
I find sometimes when I watch like an object
Yeah.
with properties, sometimes even nested, if I change it, the reactivity does not kick in.
Yeah.
Is there a certain point that we know, is that a property change or is that nested?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think with reactivity, there are some caveats to how exactly things get updated. So for example, even if it's nested, it should work. But if it's, for example, an array, and then you pop an item off of the array, Vue's reactivity doesn't know that that has happened. And so you have to do like a splice, or sometimes if it's an object, you have to do an object assign. So you have to create like a new object in order for Vue to notice that that change has been made. And that's a caveat in Vue 2 because of the way that Vue works. It uses getters and setters for its reactivity, which means that there's no way for it to know when an object has changed. But in Vue 3, they're using proxies, and so a lot of those caveats that we have to work on will no longer be a thing because it's able to do change detection quite well. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question about sort of approaching longer forms.
Yeah.
I have a form at work that I've been given and I have built
Sure.
in Vue, and it's like 6 or 7 steps.
Okay.
And there are steps within the steps.
Yeah.
And so I backed myself into a weird corner of like I was using the router to put steps in the URL.
Yeah.
But then I found like a sub-questions, and I kind of got myself into more complexity than I needed.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you have suggestions for managing longer complicated forms that are broken up into certain pieces.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a really good point about forms being, like a lot of real world forms being really complex. So I used to work at a startup that did real estate financial consulting or financial modeling. And so we had a giant form. Essentially what it is real estate investors will have these giant spreadsheets that they put in like their CapEx and their various loans, construction loans and so on. And so there's like multiple steps and they have to know all of those numbers are related to everything else. And so we created this form that streamlined that process so they could do it, but it means that there's like 6 or 7 steps and there's like steps within steps, like what you were mentioning. And so what we did for that is, it's difficult. It's a very difficult problem and different people have solved it differently. But what I've done in the past is create like modals sometimes so modals are annoying because with modals, you're taking a user out of their current workflow. And so that can be a bit frustrating for some cases. But modals are useful if you don't want your page to flow. For example, if there's a lot of information, it's annoying for you to like open up a giant like section because then it's overwhelming. They're like, there's so many pieces to this form, and users feel this sense of dread to fill it out. So modals are nice for those specific instances where you're like, you need to fill in this information. Like if you're filling out checkout, if you're like, oh, billing information, here's a modal, fill it out. So yeah, modals are one. I've done tabs as well. Like I've done accordions, and there's specific things where you can do inline. So there's like, if it's multiple items that are related and you show them as like itemized things, you can have them inline, you can allow inline editing. So instead of like a user having to go back to like where they were to fill out that step, to be like, here, I'm just like editing it inline. So there's like, I don't know if that's a great answer to that, but there's so many different ways of approaching this specific instance. And I've leaned heavily on Vuex for state management, just because like with multi-step forms, there's so many pieces and so many moving parts that you're like, I don't know how to keep track of where things are. And I've tried using like provide injects and it's just a mess. And so I end up just having everything read and write to the store because it's way easier that way. Yeah.
I felt by the end, I was like, should have used Vuex in the beginning.
Yeah, well, you still can. The nice thing about Vuex is that you're not penalized for not using it from the start because it automatically just works. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Anything else? Yes.
You mentioned modal.
I'm sorry? Yes, modals.
I have a case at work that they want us to remember that on this screen, I've opened this modal. If I refresh, the modal automatically opens.
Oh.
Do you try something like that before?
Have I ever tried to do that? Yeah, so actually I used to work at a company that did work for like Old Navy and stuff, and so we had modals that needed to pop up, like marketing modals. I'm actually really embarrassed I worked on that. So yeah, it's my fault. Yeah, so for that, it's usually like you could create a simple data attribute to be like has modal, and then it's always true. And it never really like defaults to false unless a user like actually clicks on the cross button. But that's one way of like notifying it's like a simple way of telling your modal. If it's a Vue component, it will just be like a VIF. And so if that VIF attribute is always true, it will just always pop out even when you refresh the page. So yeah, that's like a fast, quick way of doing it. I'm sure there's like multiple other ways. Like you could have it in the Vuex store. So the Vuex store always tells the modal to pop up, and the component itself doesn't have access to that, to the action of changing that attribute. That's another way, so yeah. Okay, I'll be around later, like I'll pretty much be in this room. And so if you have any questions, like feel free to come to me, I'm pretty friendly. But thank you so much for your attention.